Welcome to A Year of War and Peace. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. A Year of War and Peace is a daily, year-long, chapter-by-chapter reading of and meditation on Leo Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace. In these videos and podcasts, you'll be treated to a free reading of one chapter per day of the novel, plus a reflective essay I've written individually tailored to that day's chapter. These readings are offered for free, though if you'd like to support me, you can do so in one of three ways. First, you could purchase my ebook, A Year of War and Peace. It features the entire novel, plus all of my reflective essays, and it's only $2.99 on Amazon.com. You could also become a patron at patreon.com/Brian E. Denton. If you sign up there, you'll receive a sonnet once a month, plus a link to an ebook of my collected sonnets. Finally, if you like, you can make a one-time donation to my PayPal account. The email there is brianedenton@gmail.com. You can also use that email to contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Your support is greatly appreciated. Today's reading and reflection is on Chapter 150. Chapter 150. The floor of the stage consisted of smooth boards. At the sides was some painted cardboard representing trees, and at the back was a cloth stretched over boards. In the center of the stage sat some girls in red bodices and white skirts. One very fat girl in a white silk dress sat apart on a low bench, to the back of which a piece of green cardboard was glued. They all sang something. When they had finished their song, the girl in white went up to the prompter's box, and a man with tight silk trousers over his stout legs and holding a plume and a dagger went up to her and began singing, waving his arms about. First, the man in the tight trousers sang alone. Then she sang. Then they both paused while the orchestra played, and the man fingered the hand of the girl in white, obviously awaiting the beat to start singing with her. They sang together, and everyone in the theater began clapping and shouting, while the man and woman on the stage, who represented lovers, began smiling, spreading out their arms, and bowing. After her life in the country, and in her present serious mood, all this seemed grotesque and amazing to Natasha. She could not follow the opera, nor even listen to the music. She saw only the painted cardboard and the queerly dressed men and women who moved, spoke, and sang so strangely in that brilliant light. She knew what it was all meant to represent, but it was so pretentiously false and unnatural that she first felt ashamed for the actors and then amused at them. She looked at the faces of the audience, seeking in them the same sense of ridicule and perplexity she herself experienced, but they all seemed attentive to what was happening on the stage and expressed delight, which to Natasha seemed feigned. I suppose it has to be like this, she thought. She kept looking around in turn at the rows of pomaded heads in the stalls, and then at the semi-nude woman in the boxes, especially at Helene in the next box, who, apparently quite unclothed, sat with a quiet, tranquil smile, not taking her eyes off the stage. And feeling the bright light that flooded the whole place and the warm air heated by the crowd, Natasha little by little began to pass into a state of intoxication she had not experienced for a long while. She did not realize who and where she was, nor what was going on before her. As she looked and thought, the strangest fancies unexpectedly and disconnectedly passed through her mind. The idea occurred to her of jumping onto the edge of the box and singing the air the actress was singing. Then she wished to touch with her fan an old gentleman sitting not far from her, then to lean over to Helene and tickle her. At a moment when all was quiet before the commencement of a song, a door leading to the stalls on the side nearest the Rostovs' box creaked, and the steps of a belated arrival were heard. "There's Kuragin," whispered Shinshin. Countess Bezikova turned smiling to the newcomer, and Natasha, following the direction of that look, saw an exceptionally handsome adjutant approaching their box, with a self-assured yet courteous being. This was Anatoly Kuragin, whom she had seen and noticed long ago at the ball in Petersburg. He was now in an adjutant's uniform, with one epaulette and a shoulder knot. He moved with a restrained swagger, which would have been ridiculous had he not been so good-looking, and had his handsome face not worn such an expression of good-humored complacency and gaiety. Though the performance was proceeding, he walked deliberately down the carpeted gangway, his sword and spurs slightly jingling, and his handsome, perfumed head held high. Having looked at Natasha, he approached his sister, laid his well-gloved hand on the edge of her box, nodded to her, and leaning forward asked a question with a motion towards Natasha. "Mais charmant," said he, evidently referring to Natasha, who did not exactly hear his words, but understood them from the movement of his lips. Then he took his place in the first row of the stalls and sat down beside Dólokhov, nudging with his elbow in a friendly and offhand way that Dólokhov, whom others treated so fawningly. He winked at him, gaily, smiled, and rested his foot against the orchestra screen. "How like the brother is to the sister," remarked the Count, "and how handsome they both are." Shinshin, lowering his voice, began to tell the Count of some intrigue of Kuragin's in Moscow, and Natasha tried to overhear it just because he had said she was charmante. The first act was over. In the stalls, everyone began moving about, going out and coming in. Boris came to the Rostovs' box, received their congratulations very simply, and raising his eyebrows with an absent-minded smile to convey to Natasha and Sonia his fiancée's invitation to her wedding, and went away. Natasha, with a gay, coquettish smile, talked to him, and congratulated him on his approaching wedding, that same Boris with whom she had formerly been in love. In the state of intoxication she was in, everything seemed simple and natural. The scantily clad Helene smiled at everyone in the same way, and Natasha gave Boris a similar smile. Helene's box was filled and surrounded from the stalls by the most distinguished and intellectual men, who seemed to vie with one another in their wish to let everyone see that they knew her. During the whole of that entr'acte, Kuragin stood with Dólokhov in front of the orchestra partition, looking at the Rostovs' box. Natasha knew he was talking about her, and this afforded her pleasure. She even turned so that he could see her in profile, and what she thought was its most becoming aspect. Before the beginning of the second act, Pierre appeared in the stalls. The Rostovs had not seen him since their arrival. His face looked sad, and he had grown still stouter since Natasha last saw him. He passed up to the front rows, not noticing anyone. Anatoly went up to him and began speaking to him, looking at and indicating the Rostovs' box. On seeing Natasha, Pierre grew animated, and hastily passing between the rows came toward their box. When he got there, he leaned on his elbows and, smiling, talked to her for a long time. While conversing with Pierre, Natasha heard a man's voice in Countess Bezukova's box, and something told her it was Kuragin. She turned, and their eyes met. Almost smiling, he gazed straight into her eyes, with such an enraptured, caressing look that it seemed strange to be so near him, to look at him like that, to be so sure he admired her, and not to be acquainted with him. In the second act, there was scenery representing tombstones. There was a round hole in the canvas to represent the moon, shades were raised over the footlights, and from horns and contrabass came deep notes, while many people appeared from right and left, wearing black cloaks and holding things like daggers in their hands. They began waving their arms. Then some other people ran in and began dragging away the maiden, who had been in white and was now in light blue. They did not drag her away at once, but sang with her for a long time, and then at last dragged her off, and behind the scenes something metallic was struck 3 times, and everyone knelt down and sang a prayer. All these things were repeatedly interrupted by the enthusiastic shouts of the audience. During this act, every time Natasha looked toward the stalls, she saw Anatoly Kuragin, with an arm thrown across the back of his chair, staring at her. She was pleased to see that he was captivated by her, and it did not occur to her that there was anything wrong in it. When the second act was over, Countess Bezukova rose, turned to the Rostovs' box, her whole bosom completely exposed, beckoned to the old Count with a gloved finger, and paying no attention to those who entered the box, began talking to him with an amiable smile. "Do make me acquainted with your charming daughters," she said. "The whole town is singing their praises, and I don't even know them." Natasha rose and curtsied to the splendid countess. She was so pleased by praise from this brilliant beauty that she blushed with pleasure. "I want to become a Muscovite too now," said Helene. "How is it you're not ashamed to bury such pearls in the country?" Countess Bezukova quite deserved her reputation of being a fascinating woman. She could say what she did not think, especially what was flattering, quite simply and naturally. "Dear Count, you must let me look after your daughters. Though I am not staying here long this time, nor are you, I will try to amuse them. I have already heard much of you in Petersburg and wanted to get to know you," said she to Natasha with her stereotyped and lovely smile. "I had heard about you from my page, Drubetskoy. Have you heard he is getting married? And also from my husband's friend, Bolkonsky, Prince Andrew Bolkonsky," she went on with special emphasis, implying that she knew of his relation to Natasha. To get better acquainted, she asked that one of the young ladies should come into her box for the rest of the performance, and Natasha moved over to it. The scene of the third act represented a palace in which many candles were burning, and pictures of knights with short beards hung on the walls. In the middle stood what were probably a king and a queen. The knight waved his right arm and, evidently nervous, saying something badly and sat down on a crimson throne. The maiden, who had been at first in white and then in light blue, now wore only a smock and stood beside the throne with her hair down. She sang something mournfully, addressing the queen, but the king waved his arms severely, and men and women with bare legs came in from both sides and began dancing all together. Then the violins played very shrilly and merrily, and one of the women with thick bare legs and thin arms, separating from the others, went behind the wings, adjusted her bodice, returned to the middle of the stage, and began jumping and striking one foot rapidly against the other. In the stalls, everyone clapped and shouted bravo. Then one of the men went into the corner of the stage. The cymbals and horns in the orchestra struck up more loudly, and this man with bare legs jumped very high and waved his feet about very rapidly. He was Duport, who received 60,000 rubles a year for this art. Everybody in the stalls, boxes, and galleries began clapping and loudly shouting with all their might, and the man stopped and began smiling and bowing to all sides. Then other men and women danced with bare legs. Then the king again shouted to the sound of music, and they all began singing. But suddenly, a storm came on. Chromatic scales and diminished sevenths were heard in the orchestra. Everyone ran off, again dragging one of their number away, and the curtain dropped. Once more there was a terrible noise and clatter among the audience, and with rapturous faces everyone began shouting, "Duport! Duport! Duport!" Natasha no longer thought this strange. She looked about with pleasure, smiling joyfully. "Isn't Duport delightful?" Helene asked her. "Oh, yes," replied Natasha. All right, so that concludes my reading of chapter 150. Hope you liked it. I'll now proceed to my reflection on the same. A Year of War and Peace, Day 150. Moloch, whose eyes are 1,000 blind windows. There is a strain in our literature that views the city as corrupting and inimical to good morals. Sita, the heroine of the great Indian epic the Ramayana, for instance, is a foundling child discovered one day in the bucolic setting of a verdant field. She grows into the very image of innocence and beauty. It's only after Prince Rama of the Ayodhya kingdom wins her hand in marriage and takes her back to the city with all its court intrigue and deceit that the epic takes a turn towards danger and menace. From the book of Genesis, we have both the story of Joseph, whose pastoral rearing guards him against the degrading influence of urban life near the seat of power in Egypt, and also that paragon of the wicked city, Sodom and Gomorrah. More recently, there is Ginsberg's Nightmare of Moloch, Moloch the loveless, mental Moloch, Moloch the heavy judger of men, Moloch whose eyes are 1,000 blind windows. And then, of course, we have William Blake's 18th century London, where every face is plagued by marks of weakness, marks of woe. Tolstoy adopts a variation of the Sita story for Natasha in today's chapter. As the first act of the opera begins, Natasha thinks the production is ridiculous. It's absurd to her that people would take it seriously when it's so obviously counterfeit. After her life in the country, we're told, and in her present serious mood, all this seemed grotesque and amazing to Natasha. But then, something happens. Natasha, embodying all of Moscow society, especially Helene, becomes intoxicated by the urbanity of it all. When Helene's brother Anatoly enters the scene, strutting into her life with the swagger of 1,000 of Penelope's suitors, it's game over. The intoxication is overwhelming. She submits to the life of the city. Where before all was pretentiously false and unnatural, now everything seems simple and natural. Naturally, the second act of the opera features a group of people dragging away a maiden, formerly dressed in white, now in blue. This is exactly the design Anatoly has for Natasha. He's aiming to drag her away. It will be tough for Natasha to withstand his charm. On the one hand, as we've argued throughout A Year of War and Peace, she'll want to maintain her cosmopolitanism and fellowship with others. On the other, she'll need to be vigilant against the moral corruption of city life. Daily meditation. Contact with crowds is deleterious. Inevitably, vice will be made attractive or imprinted on us or smeared upon us without our being aware of it. In every case, the larger the crowd with which we mingle, the greater the danger. Seneca, Letter on Crowds. All right, that concludes my reading of and reflection on chapter 150 of War and Peace. I hope you liked it. Thanks so much for joining me. Remember that if you'd like to support me, you can do so either by purchasing the ebook, A Year of War and Peace, becoming a patron at patreon.com, or making a one-time donation at PayPal. The links to all that are below in the show notes. Tomorrow we're going to be reading and reflecting on chapter 151. I hope you'll join me. Until then, take care of yourselves and others.